Welcome to 5 signs you may have ADHD and autism. And I said you may have because you never want to use one video to diagnose yourself. However, I will link some self-diagnostic tests down in the notes section, and I will link the research articles I am using in today's video. It is important to keep in mind that we are always evolving in these topics. For example, not that long ago, the DSM, which is what we use to diagnose, would not even allow you to give a person a diagnosis of both ADHD and autism, and today we know there is significant overlap. So just to give you a quick reminder of why this is so challenging, I think it's important because people can get really down in the dirt about whether or not that's ADHD and that's autism. But because there are so many overlapping traits, it can make it difficult. But they can kind of sabotage each other within you. That is that conflicting dynamic. And sabotage in a good way and or a bad way or a neutral way. But the bottom line is that exists. So let's quickly summarize, or I will for you quickly, why it's so difficult to separate these two neurocognitive profiles which have so many similarities. So that today's video is not 5 hours long, I'm just going to quickly go through these dynamics, but it's worth coming back to perhaps at a different day. Here are the things that both ADHD and autism share and overlap in. Now, they might play out in a little bit different ways and for different reasons, the internal and the cognitive motivation or the neurocognitive motivation, but here they are. Stimming and fidgeting, sensory issues, sensory differences, impulse control issues, executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation difficulties, higher rates of self-wounding, addiction, depression, anxiety, EDs, OCD, and bipolar in every level. There's a lot of mental health overlap. Difficulty with responding to or managing communication patterns and sort of how we engage. So things like info dumping, connecting over shared interests, story swapping, things like that. Increased risks of being victims of harm, different ways of thinking about the world and different patterns, different thought patterns, special interests and passions, hyperfixations, hyperfocus dynamics, task switching, so how you go from one thing to the next, difficulties, neurodivergent masking, so how you show up in the world, eye contact differences, social differences, and the tendency to passionately focus on something in like deep dive, kind of like hyperfixation way, like I was saying. So those are the similarities. Now let's get into the 5 signs. Before I do that though, as I did not say in the beginning, please remember that the heart of these two dynamics of autism and ADHD are similar but different in these ways. Autism is characterized by difficulties with neurotypical social interaction and communication. And it has a tendency, as alongside of all of this, to also self-regulate through repetition and routines, as opposed to ADHD, which is characterized by difficulty regulating attention and difficulty often with hyperactivity and impulsivity. But you can have ADHD and not have hyperactivity. There are 3 types: the inattentive type, the hyperactive impulsive type, and the combined type. Really important. And that is not the topic of today's video, but I will talk about it more, okay? So that's the kind of general gist of what we're talking about. So what happens? How do you look at the similarities? Number 1 of the signs. If you have autism or ADHD, there's a very good chance that you at least have subclinical traits of the other, if not the full-blown presentation. Why do I say that? I say that because many studies show that anywhere from like 20 to 80% of those with autism also have traits of ADHD. Other studies show that about 30 to 65-ish% of those with ADHD also have autistic traits, significant autistic traits. And even twin studies and family studies show consistently a substantial genetic overlap between the two conditions. So if you have one child, theoretically, that has more ADHD and one that has autism, there's a very good chance that you may have both traits as well, or if your partner does and things like that. There's a lot of pretty strong genetic evidence. We know there are other reasons for things like autism, but generally speaking, we're talking about a pretty significant genetic dynamic that occurs. And so it is important to understand that instead of trying to say it's this and not that, to maybe make it an and or both. Okay. Number 2, social dynamics. If you tend to struggle with both social engagement, reading cues, and functioning in this sort of neurotypical world, and you're also more highly socially motivated, you may have both. That is one of the big things that one article found, is that those with autism tend to have a more subjective experience of socializing, and those with ADHD tend to intrinsically get more out of it and be more motivated. So if you do both and have both, that is likely a possibility. Number 3, you can, if you have both autism and ADHD, you might have a tendency to be hyperactive and impulsive while also having a more hyper-focused presentation. What do I mean? I mean that in the autistic sort of classic profile, we're often talking about having this like special interest, intensity in one topic, which you can also do with ADHD. But if you also have patterns of hyperactivity and impulsivity, and you have autistic traits, there's a very good chance you have both. So for example, I've been doing this research going, I never would have thought I would have the diagnosable ADHD, but things like being a massive procrastinator and then still doing well, talking really fast, lots of things that can also be autism, but being in one task and quickly switching to another, like I'm cleaning this room and now I'm going to go in the garden. I mean, that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is if you have those both, you probably, both patterns, you probably have both. Now, the hyperfocus can vary. I'm not going to go into that today on ADHD and autistic profiles and kind of how and why and the breadth and depth of that. But we know, for example, monotropism, which is a frequently referred to theory, which I will talk about in another video, is often associated with autism, that we can see those similar patterns in some regard also in ADHD. Number 4, if you have a tendency to seek novelty, your brain needs new, but you also crave and really need familiarity, you know what to expect, the familiar dynamics, you may have both. So why you're doing this and what's happening can vary, but the bottom line is that those with both autism and ADHD can have this kind of dynamic going on where their brain just needs new, the ADHD part, but the autistic part craves the predictable, familiar dynamics. And number 5, if you have a real need for routines and repetition in that regard, like I do it this way, a systems dynamic, or the way that you just live your life can have that kind of rigid routine dynamic, rigid in a good way, meaning that you need it to be a certain way in the steps because that helps you feel more in control and more regulated, but you also have difficulty sticking to that and regulating attention, you may have both ADHD and autism. So the dynamic is that push-pull, right? Where the ADHD brain might have that hyperactivity, that impulsivity that pulls the person out of the routine. And that kind of went back to what I was saying about novelty. These are very similar. But the bottom line is that what's happening here for us and the things we use, like repetitive behaviors and hyperactivity, those can kind of mix in together and get really confusing. And so the bottom line is, what is the drive for those things and where is it coming from and why? So those are, I believe, the 5 big dynamics that if you have both, there's a very good chance you may have both autism and ADHD. That is it for today's video. I hope you found this helpful. Please feel free to share more. And I just want to say that I love you guys so much when I post things that are about autism. I definitely get a different set of comments, which are just, I love all of them, whether it's trauma or both, because we know trauma is very common in autism, but it's really fascinating and I'm learning a lot from you and I appreciate you so much. And so I thank you all for being here and I hope that you found this helpful and I hope you have a beautiful day. Take care and stay safe. I'll see you soon. Bye.